Welcome, 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 my lovely brothers and sisters. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depends on where you are in the world. Today we will end paper 74 of the Urantia book, which was all about Adam and Eve, and is a paper from the second book of the Urantia book that is all about the history of Urantia. And today we go through the last sections known as Life in the Garden and the Legend of Creation. And we will learn about the last, what has happened, and why we have a twisted and a very chaotic version described in the Bible. So let us remove this one, go to screen share so you can all read along with me. And let's start. Section 7, Life in the Garden. The children of Adam, except for 4 years, attendants at the Western schools, lived and worked in the east of Eden. They were trained intellectually until they were 16 in accordance with the methods of the Jerusalem schools. And Jerusalem is the headquarters of our system, Satania. From 16 to 20, they were taught in the Urantia schools at the other end of the garden, serving there also as teachers in the lower grades. The entire purpose of the Western school system of the garden was socialization. The forenoon periods of recess were devoted to practical horticulture and agriculture. The afternoon periods to competitive play. The evenings were employed in social intercourse and the cultivation of personal friendships. Well, if I would say this, let us introduce this way of educational system again. And then we will get a more socialized people in this world who truly can live as brothers and sisters with each other. Religious and sexual training were regarded as the province of the home, the duty of parents. Well, this is still being done, although in a distorted version, but there are still parents doing this task. The teaching in these schools included instruction regarding 1. Health and the care of the body, 2. The golden rule, the standard of social intercourse, and 3. The relation of individual rights to the group rights and community obligations. 4. History and culture of the various earth races. 5. Methods of advancing and improving world trade. And then 6. Coordination of conflicting duties and emotions. 7. The cultivation of play, humor, and competitive substitutes for physical fighting. The schools, in fact, every activity of the garden were always open to visitors. Unarmed observers were freely admitted to Eden for short visits. To sojourn in the garden, a Urantian had to be so-called adopted. He received instructions in the plan and purpose of the Adamic bestowal, signified his intention to adhere to this mission, and then made declaration of loyalty to the social rule of Adam and the spiritual sovereignty of the Universal Father. The laws of the garden were based on the older codes of Dalmatia and were promulgated under 7 heads. 1. The laws of health and sanitation. 2. Social regulations of the garden. 3. The code of trade and commerce. 4. The laws of fair play and competition. 5. The laws of home life. 6. The civil codes of the golden rule. And 7. The 7 commands of supreme moral rule. So if you read this and are hearing this, then we can say we should only live by these 7 laws instead of the millions and millions of laws that people themselves have written to manipulate and control their fellow brothers and sisters. So the law system that we know on earth is completely based on manipulation and control of the rest, and has nothing to do with what we are reading here. So in actuality, we should live by 7 laws. Well, 7 laws, that's to do, and that is something to be easily taught to the rest. The moral law of Eden was little different from the 7 commandments of Dalmatia, but the Adamites taught many additional reasons for these commands. For instance, regarding the injunction against murder, the indwelling of the thought adjuster was presented as an additional reason for not destroying human life. So the thought adjuster is the God, the Father fragment in each one of us. Each and every human being has this piece of God in him, her. And humanity is killing on daily basis, so the human races are for a far too long time not obeying and following the laws of the universe, and these laws are the 7 laws I've mentioned. They taught that whoso sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. The public worship hour of Eden was noon. Sunset was the hour of family worship. Adam did his best to discourage the use of set prayers, teachings that effective prayer must be wholly individual, that it must be the desire of the soul. But the Edenites continued to use the prayers and forms handed down from the times of Dalmatia. Adam also endeavored to substitute the offerings of the fruit of the land for the blood sacrifices in the religious ceremonies, but had made little progress before the disruption of the garden. So here we can read about the beginning story of the confusion and chaoticness around Cain and Abel. And due to the fact that the first at least 8 books of the Old Testament represents a primitive God concept in which the people of these days, times and ages saw who God was and thought that they needed to please God with all sorts of animal sacrifices and blood offerings and what else, but that was all based on how our forefathers understood who God was. Unfortunately, in the day of today, there are still people, religious people, that are doing animal sacrifices. So these people are completely confused, highly confused, They still think that they can please God with burnt offerings and animal sacrifices and whatever you have. But this is primitive, and these people are in actuality practicing a primitive based religion. Um, Adam definitely taught them that the woman, equally with the man, contributes those life factors which unite to form a new being. Therefore, mankind had presumed that all procreation resided in the so-called loins of the father. They had looked upon the mother as being merely a provision for nurturing the unborn and nursing the newborn. Even this is something you can read, especially in the first 3, 4 books of the Old Testament. There's a lot of disrespect regarding the women, the female. Adam taught his contemporaries all they could comprehend, but that was not very much, comparatively speaking. Nevertheless, the more intelligent of the races of earth looked forward eagerly to the time when they would be permitted to intermarry with the superior children of the violet race. And what a different world Urantia would have become if this great plan of uplifting the races had been carried out. So that was the main reason why Adam and Eve were here, to uplift all the human races into the violet race. Even as it was, tremendous gains resulted from the small amount of the blood of this important race, which the evolutionary peoples incidentally secured. And thus did Adam work for the welfare and uplift of the world of his sojourn. But it was difficult task to lead these mixed and mongrel peoples in the better way. And then the last section of paper 74, which is all about the legend of creation. So let us hear and read what the Urantia book tells us, or the celestials whom have written this book, what they are handing over to us the information about the legend of creation. The story of the creation of Urantia in 6 days was based on the tradition that Adam and Eve had spent just 6 days in their initial survey of the garden. This circumstance lent almost sacred sanction to the time period of the week, which had been originally introduced by the Dalmatians, Adam's spending 6 days inspecting the garden and formulating preliminary plans for organization was not prearranged. It was worked out from day to day. The choosing of the 7th day for worship was wholly incidental to the facts herewith narrated. The legend of the making of the world in 6 days was an afterthought. In fact, more than 30,000 years afterwards. One feature of the narrative, the sudden appearance of the sun and moon, may have taken origin in the traditions of the one-time sudden emergence of the world from a dense space cloud of minute matter which had long obscured both sun and moon. The story of creating Eve out of Adam's rib is a confused condensation of the Adamic arrival and the celestial surgery connected with the interchange of living substances associated with the coming corporeal staff of the planetary prince more than 450,000 of years previously. The majority of the world's peoples have been influenced by the tradition that Adam and Eve had physical forms created for them upon their arrival on Urantia. The belief in man's having been created from clay was well nigh universal in the Eastern Hemisphere. This tradition can be traced from the Philippine Islands around the world to Africa, and many groups accepted this story of man's clay origin by some form of special creation in the place of the earlier beliefs in progressive creation, known as evolution. Away from the influences of Dalmatia and Eden, mankind tended toward the belief in the gradual ascent of the human race. The fact of evolution is not a modern discovery. The ancients understood the slow and evolutionary character of human progress. The early Greeks had clear ideas of this despite their proximity to Mesopotamia, although the various races of Earth became sadly mixed up in their notions of evolution. Nevertheless, many of the primitive tribes believed and taught that they were the descendants of various animals. Primitive peoples made a practice of selecting for their so-called totems the animals of their supposed ancestry. Certain North American Indian tribes believed they originated from beavers and coyotes. Certain African tribes teach that they are descendants from the hyena, and Malay tribe from the lemur. A New Guinea group from the parrot. The Babylonians, because of immediate contact with the remnants of the civilization of the Adamites, enlarged and embellished the story of man's creation. They taught that he had descended directly from the gods. They held to an aristocratic origin for the race which was incompatible with even the doctrine of creation out of clay. The Old Testament account of creation dates from long after the time of Moses. And here it comes. Moses, he never taught the Hebrews such a distorted story. Never. But he did present a simple and condensed narrative of creation to the Israelites, hoping thereby to augment his appeal to worship the Creator, the universal Father, who Moses, called the Lord God of Israel. And it's now about time for us people to let go of all these concepts, ideas, sayings, and whatever, and just get used to the idea of one universal Father for every peoples and nations. So there is no longer a God of Israel anymore. It's just universal Father or God in heaven for all peoples and nations. In these early teachings, Moses very wisely did not attempt to go back of Adam's time. And since Moses was the supreme teacher of the Hebrews, the stories of Adam became intimately associated with those of creation. That the earlier traditions recognize pre-Adamic civilization is clearly shown by the fact that, and here it comes, later editors intending to eradicate all reference to human affairs before Adam's time. But the editors, neglected to remove the telltale reference to Cain's immigration to the land of Nod, where he took himself a wife. The Hebrews had no written language in general usage for a long time after they reached Palestine. They learned the use of an alphabet from the neighboring Philistines, who were political refugees from the higher civilization of Crete. The Hebrews did little writing until about 900 BC. And having no written language until such a late date, they had several different stories of creation in circulation. But after the Babylonian captivity, they inclined more toward accepting a modified Mesopotamian version. Jewish tradition became crystallized about Moses, and because he endeavored to trace the lineage of Abraham back to Adam, the Jews assumed that Adam was the first of all mankind, which of course was not the case at all. Yahweh was the creator, and since Adam was supposed to be the first man, he must have made the world just prior to making Adam. And then the tradition of Adam's 6 days got woven into the story, with the result that almost 1,000 years after Moses' sojourn on earth, the tradition of creation in 6 days was written out and subsequently credited to him, which was not the case that he had written it. When the Jewish priests returned to Jerusalem, they had already completed the writing of their narrative of the beginning of things. Soon they made claims that this recital was a recently discovered story of creation written by Moses. But the contemporary Hebrews of around 500 BC did not consider these writings to be divine revelations. They didn't saw this. They looked upon them much as later peoples regard mythological narratives. So this means that the Bible is in actuality a very allegorious, symbolic and mythologic book. This spurious document, reputed to be the teachings of Moses, was brought to attention of Ptolemy, the Greek king of Egypt, who had it translated into Greek by a commission of 70 scholars for his new library at Alexandria. And so this account found its place among those writings, which subsequently became a part of the later collections of the, between quotation marks, sacred scriptures of the Hebrew and Christian religions. And through identification with these theological systems, such concepts for a long time profoundly influenced the philosophy of many Occidental peoples. The Christian teachers perpetuated the belief in the fiat creation of the human race, and all this led directly to the formation of the hypothesis of a one-time golden age of utopian bliss and the theory of the fall of man or Superman, which accounted for the non-utopian condition of society. Earth, and thus Urantia, has never known a golden age. These outlooks on life and man's place in the universe were at best discouraging, since they were predicated upon a belief in retrogression rather than progression, as well as implying a vengeful deity who had vented wrath upon the human race in retribution of the errors of certain one-time planetary administrators. The so-called golden age is a myth. There has never been a golden age on this planet. Never. But Eden was a fact, and the garden civilization was actually overthrown. Adam and Eve carried on in the garden for 117 years, when, through the impatience of Eve and the errors of judgment of Adam, they presumed to turn aside from the ordained way and broke in actuality the covenant and agreements they had made between the Melchizedeks and Michael of Nebadon. And because of this, havoc started to be created in the first Garden of Eden, which made Adam and Eve to leave the first garden voluntarily, speedily bringing disaster upon themselves and ruinous retardation upon the developmental progression of all Urantia. And with this said, I have come to the end of reading the entire paper 74, in which we have come to understand more about Adam and Eve, their life in the first Garden of Eden. We came to know more about the life in the first Garden of Eden, about the school system, about the 7 laws, about Adam's administration, about a bit more about the children of Adam and Eve. And in the next paper, 75, it's all about the default of Adam and Eve, and then we start to get more in-depth clarification and information. What truly went wrong in the first Garden of Eden. And as you already have could hear and read, it all was because of impatience and the errors of judgment of Adam that created havoc in the first Garden of Eden. But something else also happened, but we will learn that the next time. All the information in the entire paper 74 that I have presented to you the last few days, and I'm just a messenger that brings this information to my brothers and sisters. All the information in paper 74 has been given to us by Solonia, the seraphic voice in the garden. And thank you, Solonia, for giving us peoples, Urantians, here on Urantia, this very valuable information about Adam and Eve and their life in the first Garden of Eden. All right, I leave the screen share and I go back to the end screen. And I want to say to you all, my lovely brothers and sisters, please set aside everything that you have learned about Adam and Eve, about the creation of earth, about how everything got into existence. Leave it aside, set it aside, and take this information with an open mind, re-listen and reread it. Um, Go to the Urantia website, the urantiafoundation.org website, download the free PDF Urantia book, um, reread this entire chapter for yourself and meditate upon it with the help of the Holy Spirit and the Spirit of truth. And ask them to give you more clarification and in depth about the information that has come to you. With this said,